All right. So I'm going to tell you all a story. It's a journey basically from Atlassian around how we transformed our cloud products from running on-premise to running in the cloud, and how we moved from using primarily Monolith to using microservices, all in the span of about 2 years. We're going to leave room for Q&A at the end. I think Danielle actually posted in the chat that you can sort of ask your questions in there, and we'll get to them at the end. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm actually going to breeze through the project itself. I'm going to spend a lot of time on the lessons that we learned. So I'm Mike. I run platform at Atlassian. I've done a few of these infrastructure migrations before. And I always think the value in these kind of talks is around the lessons, the meat of it. What are the things that we wish we knew when we started? And so I want to tell all of you about that. So, but first, a little bit of a primer. So Atlassian is a multi-product company. We have a lot of products. Some of them you know, some of them you might not know. For this talk, we're primarily going to talk about JIRA and Confluence, the ones in the upper left there. Atlassian also gives customers a choice, right? So way back in like 2002, 2003, when you got our products, JIRA and Confluence at the time, you would basically get like a CD with a WAR file on it, and that would be JIRA, and you'd run it yourself. Today, there's actually a lot of customers that choose a similar deployment option. We call that our on-prem offerings or our BTF offerings. That's server and data center, which is you run the products by yourself. But Atlassian also has a cloud offering, which is our SaaS offering for those customers that want Atlassian to host it themselves. And we've seen that more and more customers want that today, but we still have a fair amount of customers running on server and data center. So let's go back. Let's go back all the way to 2010. So in 2010, Atlassian launched something called On Demand. This was the original version of our cloud SaaS product. Predating that a little bit was something called JIRA Studio, but we're not going to go into that. But in 2010, we had an infrastructure we called Unicorn. So when you signed up for one of our products, for JIRA Confluence, and you wanted a cloud instance, the way we did it in the back end is we had racks, we had colos, and we would actually spin up virtual machines and a database for every single customer. You were a customer, you wanted a Confluence, here's an instance, here's a database. It was single tenanted, it was stateful. Our desired end state, basically now fast forward all the way to late 2015, is we're facing some scaling challenges. We're running into issues where, imagine if you're a very large customer and you're still only running on one single instance. It's like a house that's too small for your family. You're basically bursting at the seams, and we face that problem a lot. We also dealt with all of the usual issues of running on-prem, which was, I couldn't tell you how many times I had to deal with RAID card failures, storage array problems, and direct connect links going down. Like, that was just a part of life back then. We wanted to be out of that business. We wanted to be sitting on public cloud, and we wanted to be using shared microservices, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We also wanted the whole system to be stateless instead of stateful. So one of the first decisions that we made was, because we had the same code base for both our on-prem offerings and cloud, is do we fork? And we decided yes. The product that you're using today, so if you're using JIRA on-prem or you're using JIRA in the cloud, they're actually different code bases. Way back in early 2016, we actually decided to fork the code base to allow us to fully utilize and go cloud native on our JIRA and Confluence offering. So that was sort of our first big decision. We also ended up forking the org. So even within Atlassian, we basically divided the business up into an on-prem business and a cloud business. So next big decision, do you lift and shift? So for Atlassian, if you remember, I was saying that we had a stateful single tenanted system running on-prem, and we wanted a multi-tenant stateless system. We couldn't just lift and shift the stateful system into AWS, because I think we would have been, at the time, probably number 2 or number 3 largest AWS customer in the world if we would have done so, just given the resources involved. So we actually transformed the products during the transformation. So we lifted, re-architected, and then landed. And we named this project Vertigo. And the reason we named it Vertigo was, it's funny, it's actually a funny story. When we were describing the scope of the project to one of Atlassian's senior engineering managers, he said, I understand it, it makes a lot of sense, but it's giving me vertigo. And that's why we named the project Vertigo. So yes, this was actually the largest project Atlassian has ever done. It took us hundreds of developers 2 years to basically pull this off. So did it work? I mentioned we spent 2 years on this. I will walk through a little bit of a timeline, but I want to first tell you, did the thing work? Well, the answer is yes. We were able to move over 100,000 customer instances in 10 months, basically from our on-prem system to AWS. And we did this without customers knowing about it, right? And it's not that we wanted to keep it a secret, it's that we didn't want an excuse for poor reliability or poor performance. It's an easy thing to cover and say, hey, we're doing an infrastructure migration, expect lots of downtime. We didn't want that excuse. We wanted to do this pretty quietly. And as a reminder of the timeline, we started the whole project in January 2016. The last customer moved over in December 2017. So the last year of the project was pretty much the migration. The first year was prep. And interestingly, that last 6 months was the last 5% of our customers. And I'll explain why that is. So again, focusing on results here, did we get out of it what we wanted? So the answer first is for customers, yes. We can actually push features out here a lot faster. Prior, we can only push out updates to our products once a week at best. We now release 2 to 3 times a day, which is really, really good. 2, those scaling problems I mentioned about customers sort of bursting at the seams, we are now, multi-tenant and stateless. So we can spread single customers across multiple instances. And if you've seen any of our announcements recently, we can support much, much larger instance sizes for customers as a result, plus spinning up regions in Europe and Sydney, et cetera. Downtime is reduced. Stateful systems require downtime to upgrade, right? So when we would deploy to JIRA and Confluence once a week, it had customer downtime. That is no longer needed. And because of the faster dev loop, our rollbacks are fast now too, when we need to. And then lastly, it's just a snappier, more reliable system. We're relying on a lot of enhancements and things done by a public cloud provider, which is AWS, that's really, really helped us. And we saw a big drop in customer complaints as a result. But our own internal benefits as well. We had hard scaling problems. We actually ended up building a common platform for running microservices that helped us do these 12 months of massive surgery, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So from a microservices perspective, right, we had JIRA and Confluence. So to understand this, these are multi-million line, 15-year-old products running in Java. And so we wanted to start to decompose those monoliths and run microservices. In January 2016, I remember this well. In January 2016, we had about 15 total microservices running for the business. Today, I've got over 1,300. The only way we could support something like that is by having a common platform that we use to build those microservices, which is our PaaS. So we also, as a result, we have happier teams. We've got more autonomous teams now than we did in the past. In a monolith, there's only one way to do everything, and everything goes up to basically a pull request that gets reviewed by a few folks on the team. We've got happier teams now. They've got higher vital sign scores. And then lastly, we had a big culture change, right? To you build it, you run it, which I'll talk about in the lessons as well. So as I mentioned before, the meat of this really is in the lessons that we learned through the actual migration. So we moved from a stateful single-tenanted system to stateless microservices. What did we learn? So I'll tell you 3 big lessons that I think you can take away from this. So first, how do you know when your transformation is done? How do you know what you're doing? I've done a few of these infrastructure projects before. They tend to balloon out of control unless they're constrained. Do you migrate 100% of your customers, or is it okay to migrate only 90%? Do you take 2 years or do you take 5 years? Should you decompose your monolith or not? These are all questions that you really got to think about early on. And I can tell you what made sense for Atlassian, because they might make sense for your business. So the first thing, Atlassian, we have a suite of products, right? And so we had a desire to build a set of common functionality to allow us to have leverage from those set of products. Therefore, for us, building a common platform was an important driver for actually doing this move to AWS, because we wanted a common platform to power our products and future products we would acquire and future products we would build. That was important for us. If you're a single product company, it might be actually overkill for you to do that. Secondly, Atlassian, even at the time we started this, had like 5 different dev centers around the world where we had engineers. We had distributed teams already, and those teams were basically held back by all going through a centralized monolith for their work. So we know we wanted to support these teams in an autonomous fashion. Thus, microservices made some sense for us. And then lastly, Those scaling problems, like I mentioned before, we knew we were at the wall with our scaling. We could have said, "No, it's good enough. Our cloud's only good for small customers," but we knew that that was not the desire from the business. So these three things together really were the reasons that we decided to go stateless, why we went for microservices, and why we decided to spend basically focus so intensely on this project at the time that we did. But think about your own reasons for your moves. So the second thing, tooling. During the project, we actually ended up building a ton of tools. If you remember from my slide earlier, we spent the last 10 months doing the migration. But what was that whole first year doing? Were we just sitting around? No, we were building static code analyzers and cohort analysis tools to let us segment our customers up so we know how to move them, service registries and catalogs. In fact, let me just show you. So here's a bunch of tools that we ended up building as a result of this project. The first thing is microscope. When you've got 1,300 microservices, how do you know what's what? We ended up building our own internal service catalog for us to keep track of all these microservices, who owns them, what happens when there's an incident with them, etc. All that was built at that time. Second thing is tech stacks. Atlassian is polyglot by our nature, but we had some common tech stacks, I would say, like Spring Boot and Java was a pretty typical one at the time, same thing with Node. And we ended up building some common patterns, images for things like Docker that basically helped our teams build faster. And then third, an operational maturity model, right? When you're building a microservice, how do you know when it's safe to actually deploy the thing in production, right? So we basically had a series of checks that we would go through. And I hope that you're noticing a theme as I'm talking through all of these tools. These are platform tools that allow multiple engineers within a company to all build and run services decentralized. So these are things that help us what we call define a golden path for developers. And I would say that from a scale perspective, this was probably one of the best decisions that we made early on in the project. We didn't just start migrating customers right away. We instead invested in some tools, knowing that our project was a marathon and not a sprint. And I think earlier in my career, I wouldn't have made that choice. And later now I know how much smarter it is to take a few minutes prior to the start of your project and actually spend time on these tools. The third, I would say this is the one that we really didn't think through that much at the start of the project, but it really became incredibly impactful. And I would say of all of the lessons, this is the one that can come back and bite you and your company. So it's about the people. So let me talk about what that means. When you're doing a migration, it's actually not just a technical migration. It is also a people change. It's an org change. We had, as an example, when I mentioned before, we had a monolith and we were moving to microservices. Yet we had some teams of like 2 people, 3 people that ran some features. If you move that to running a service, 2 people does not an on-call rotation make. And so as a result of this move, we found that when we exited the Vertigo project, we actually had a whole new org structure for our developers. And that was a pretty overt thing. And that was a big change from a people perspective, but I feel it was a really good one. Secondly, managing expectations. I've done these projects before where you essentially go down into the boiler room and you don't come out for a year until the project is done. That's a huge mistake. What is very, very important, especially for large infrastructure migrations where you have a lot of people involved, the business wants to know, are we going to get a return on that investment? So it's very important to keep up your communications with your executive team, your stakeholders, your customers, your partners, and the rest of your R&D organization to make sure that they know what you're doing, the benefits that you have there, and making sure you celebrate successes. Lastly, embracing that culture shift. I mentioned before this whole you build it, you run it model. Atlassian in 2015 was a take the code and throw it over the wall and the ops team runs it and deploys it. By the end of 2017, every developer in Atlassian was on call running their own services. So it was a complete shift there. And I think that we spent more time, I would say personally, I spent more time making sure our SRE team was successful in this project than almost any other work that I did during the project, because the culture shift was the biggest long-term difference for Atlassian as a result of the Vertigo project. So those people topics, do not underestimate them. And I lied before about 3 lessons. I actually have a 4th. This is the bonus lesson. So balancing speed and trust. So I have a confession to make. This whole Vertigo project, we could have actually done it a lot faster, a lot faster. When we were through, I would say, the first 4 months of our migrations, we were now through, in the first 4 months, we got through about 80% of our customers. This is the long tail. We then got down to that last 20%, the last 10%, the last 5%, the last 1%. And we had a lot of opportunities to take shortcuts. We could have just migrated some users, even though we wouldn't have a guarantee that they would have the kind of performance reliability that we wanted in the target architecture. We didn't have a guarantee, but we could have just taken a risk and just done it anyway. Because you know what? This project is really big. It's taking a long time. Maybe we just do it. And one of the values of Atlassian is don't fuck the customer. And that value actually came up from a technical discussion. In this technical discussion, where we had a choice, we could finish the project 3 or 4 months earlier, or we could really spend time on those last sets of customers. And I'm really proud that we spent the time with these last few customers. And what I mean by that, really specifically, when we got down to our last 500 customers, these are the toughest customers to migrate. Maybe they had some old configuration that we set up for them in cloud in 2011 that simply doesn't exist anymore in cloud over here, or they've got some custom capability in search that was built through a plugin that really doesn't have a great parallel in cloud. We took all those 500 customers, each one of them got put on a Trello board, and each card on that Trello board was assigned to an engineer at Atlassian who looked at that individual customer to make the move. And I would say this was the difference from a project that almost finishes to actually finishes. How many of you have ever done one of these migrations and you're on the third migration and the prior 2 migrations never really finished? Well, this one actually finished. And this fourth lesson is how. The actual last set, that last 1%, you are way better to have individual treatment done when you get close to the end of your project than if you just still try to follow your same automated processes. That last 1% is really hard. Make sure you've got good checks and balances against folks that just want to move fast, where you've got a good connection with your customer support team. So I would say do the right thing, do them right, focus on your customers at the end there. So that was our journey. So we moved, again, over 100,000 customers running from colos to cloud. We built a platform along the way. We ended up learning a lot about our culture. We ended up with some tools that were really good, and we stayed true to our North Star. We made some mistakes, and I hope that from the lessons that we learned, you all gain value. And so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing, and we can take some questions.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi there. Thanks, Mike. We have got a few questions that have rolled in towards the end of your session, so please feel free to continue asking them in the chat, and I'll get to them. So the first question is from Brian. Which languages do you use for backend development? Using microservices, I assume you would use multiple applications with different languages.
Yeah. So about 3 years ago, the answer was, what languages are we not using? These days, we've tried to constrain it a little bit. So I'd say in the order of usage at Atlassian today, it goes Java, which is actually largely historical. Most of the new Java-like services are written in Kotlin at Atlassian. So it goes Java/Kotlin, then Node, then Go. And there's some stuff written in Python, but very little. So those are the ones we use. And we've got tech stacks that help support. You can at Atlassian build something in Clojure if you want to. The problem is you will end up having to build all the compliance checks and logging and stuff yourself that we simply don't have support for in the platform. So most devs just choose the golden path.
Great. A follow-up question, Kat. You talked a little bit about the team makeup. How do we at Atlassian solve for the DevOps model?
How do we solve for the DevOps model ourselves?
Yes.
Yeah. So we use our own tools. No surprise there to actually do a fair bit of that. We've also aligned an SRE organization that helps serve in the DevOps function. DevOps functions tend to be split within Atlassian between our engineering organization directly, who run and manage services themselves, and an SRE team that acts in support of them. They help. SREs are not like the team that's just on call at Atlassian. They actually serve in a function that helps build monitoring and reliability and build good reliability practices for the team. But in terms of a DevOps pipeline, we use a lot of our own tools, And each product within Atlassian has a tool chain. Some of that tool chain is offered by our platform. Like all of our CI/CD, as an example, is all built through our own platform, through things like Bamboo and Bitbucket pipelines that we have built. And then that last mile is run basically by the products.
A great question from Martha. Were there any strong deniers at the start or during the project? And how were you able to change the hearts and minds of anybody pushing back?
Yeah, so the first denier was me when I first joined, because I think at this point now, I had done like 2 of these big migrations in my career. And the idea of doing a third, I was like, well, do we really need to do it? And I spent a lot of time looking at it. Yeah, there were a few deniers. I think a way that we went through that was we did a show, don't tell approach early on. So very early in 2016, what we did is we did a proof of concept to show like a customer running in a cloud environment, running on AWS. Because I won't lie, Atlassian tried to do this 2 years prior. So in 2014, we tried to do a migration to cloud and it did not work. We got, I'd say, about 3 to 6 months in, and we built a beautiful, elegant architecture, and we didn't migrate anybody. And we ran into a bunch of roadblocks. I think the best way to deal with folks that are basically not on for that journey is to show, don't tell. Actually start building some stuff and show. That really helped. That then got viewed by our founders. A thing I didn't mention, by the way, in all this, if you don't have exec support on a project like this, you're going to fail. So I think what was very important for us is our CTO and Mike and Scott, who were the co-CEOs and co-founders of Atlassian, were bought in to the solution. So I'd say that really, really helps stamp out the denying. And you want, by the way, this is important, you want some skeptics that are along with you in this ride. If it's all rose-colored glasses, you run into this optimistic architecture that we built back in 2014, which we didn't want. We want it to be practical. That's why we put such hard dates on ourselves and deadlines, to ensure that we were constrained.
Great. I think we might have time for 2 more questions. There are a lot of questions coming in, Mike, about the migration itself. Starting with, were you actively developing, or were we actively developing on JIRA, like adding new features during the migration? And also, if you can share anything about any of the tools that we used for the migration.
For the first few months of the project, we were actively building features on JIRA and Confluence while we were doing the move. And I know what this question's about. That makes things hard, doesn't it? Really hard. What ended up happening was we ended up deciding on certain types of features that were okay to build during the migration, and some that we had to say they just need to stop, because otherwise it's going to make the migration too hard. In the summer of 2016, so this was like from May through about September, we did something called the swarm. To ensure that we would have good velocity on our project, we halted all feature development for JIRA and Confluence for a few months. And we took every single developer within the products, every one of them, so hundreds of them, we all focused on aiding with the migration. Part of that was hearts and minds, to get everyone all bought into the same journey, as opposed to it being something that the backend developers, the infrastructure people are doing, because there was a fair amount of front end that needed to be done with the project too. Secondly, it was to ensure that we had good velocity and pace, such that when we came out of it, people still could build some features that our customers wanted. But yeah, I'd say you got to be very careful about the amount that you allow. Otherwise, your project will run for 6 years, which means it will never finish.
And then one last question on microservices. What are some of the roadblocks you faced while developing microservices? What kind of approach, what approach did you take to identify which microservices we needed to build?
Sure. This is the last question, so I'll try and wrap this one in a minute. Generally, the problem isn't how to make them. Developers could spin up microservices very, very fast. A day, it's up, it's running. The problem was operating them over time. And so what happened is, very early on, without a common platform, we had a proliferation of languages, logging standards, monitoring. Was it SOX compliance? Was it not SOX compliant? All of those problems were actually what we faced, not the development time of spinning them up. Those individual teams felt, no, this is great, I love this, I am operating fast. But when we wanted to do a large project or anything cross-cutting, it was very, very hard to get all these teams to work, to agree. The way that we got around that was the tech stacks was one, and then moving some of the operational concerns down into our platform. So like when you build a microservice, we tell folks, log to standard out, period. We will take care of it from there with appenders and Splunk and all of that stuff. Just do that and you're good. We then kept moving more and more and more of these concerns down that let those developers move fast while allowing us to still operate at scale. You can't run 1,000 microservices unless you have this. I hate to break it to you, you just can't. Cool. Thanks for all the questions. These are really good. And thank you, Danielle, for all your help.
Of course. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the questions.
Cheers, folks. Bye.